They thought the fire had erased everything, until a couple uncovered what was buried beneath the staircase. Some secrets refused to stay silent. Watch till the end, and don't forget to subscribe, like, and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. The car rolled to a slow stop at the mouth of the gravel drive, where the path dissolved beneath a veil of tall grass and ash-gray weeds. For a moment, neither Thomas nor Evelyn said anything. The house ahead of them rose out of the valley like a survivor of a long-forgotten war. Walls streaked with soot, windows hollow and clouded, the roof slumped in places where the years had pressed too hard. A cold wind slipped down the hillside and through the ribs of the ruined porch, carrying the faint, old smell of smoke that seemed trapped inside the bricks. Evelyn stepped out first. She stood with her hands deep in her coat pockets and looked up, letting the sunlight angle through the broken windows and scatter in pale geometry along the scorched interior walls. "It's still beautiful," she said, the words quiet enough that they almost didn't belong to her. The breeze tugged a strand of hair across her cheek. She didn't move it away. She simply watched, as if the house might turn and recognize her. Thomas joined her on the drive, the grit crunching under his boots. Beauty was not the word he would have chosen. He saw carcass-charred beams, sagging joists, an entryway yawning black where a door had once been. But he kept those thoughts to himself. The way Evelyn's voice trembled told him this was not just architecture for her, not just setbacks and budgets and hours of labor. This was something like a vow they'd spoken to each other late at night, when city sirens drew lines through their sleep, a place of their own, something they could mend and keep, something that might last longer than they would. The real estate agent lingered near the car, shuffling papers with an air of brisk detachment, though his eyes kept wandering to the dark mouth of the doorway. "Mason residence," he said when they drifted back toward him. "Mrs. Catherine Mason and her husband. Fire 6 years ago. Electrical, supposedly." He managed a quick, professional smile that wasn't steady enough to be convincing. No close family to claim it in the end, so it's been sitting. He lowered his voice as though the house could overhear. "Locals say they see lights in the upper windows some nights. Long exposures on a cloudy night can play tricks." He let out a small laugh that sounded like a breath, caught halfway to a cough. Thomas folded his arms and followed the sightline of the cracked stone columns and the grand staircase visible past the threshold. "We'll take it," he said. The agent blinked, then found the right page and thrust a pen forward. Evelyn turned toward Thomas with something like relief breaking across her face, the kind that warms you from the inside even among cold stones. By evening, the paperwork was done. They parked their small trailer just off the drive and, with flashlights and masks, stepped into the hall for the first time. The staircase dominated the space as if it were the spine of the house broad, spiraling, and scorched to a deep mahogany black, each step singing a tired, protesting note when weight pressed down. On the iron railing, pieces of old glass still clung like frost. The plaster walls held a mosaic of smoke stains, and on one section, ghostly rectangles showed where portraits had once hung, the outlines preserved where heat and soot hadn't reached. Evelyn walked with her palm hovering an inch from the wall, afraid to touch, then gave in and trailed her fingers across it. Her hand left pale streaks through the ash. "It feels like someone's still here," she whispered. "Someone is," Thomas said, glancing at her. His smile was small and honest. The word "someone" in that instant meant the two of them and the promise they had made. They started with the simple work-clearing rooms, making paths, naming spaces by what might someday exist there. Thomas pried loose unstable boards, stacked them outside, and hammered a breathable rhythm into the day. He carried a crowbar like an extension of his hand, testing the integrity of joists, tapping and listening. Evelyn gathered smaller things, The charred curve of a teacup's lip, a porcelain doorknob spotted with soot, a bent fork welded to a plate by old heat. She found a melted clock face and, cradling it as if it were an eggshell, set it in a cardboard box marked with a single word keeps. "It's proof," she said when Thomas raised an eyebrow, "that beauty can outlast what tries to end it." In the evenings they sat on folding chairs beside the trailer and drank coffee from tin cups. The house loomed behind them in a shape the night remembered. The wind changed direction. The smoke scent returned as if on a tether. Across the valley the tree line lifted and settled like a slow breath. Evelyn opened a small notebook and sketched the bones of the rooms as she imagined them restored, labeling each page with a steadiness that calmed her. Study, breakfast room, library. She drew the staircase and shaded the treads with the side of her pencil, darker near the edges, where footsteps had most often fallen. Inside, their progress was slow and stubborn, like conversation after a long silence. Thomas peeled back a section of ruined flooring in the library and found a porcelain figurine of a ballerina, half her face burned smooth and featureless. He handed it to Evelyn without announcing the find. She set the dancer on the mantel of the drawing room, what remained of it. "Let it stay," she said. "The house will know we didn't throw her away." On the third day, while clearing debris from the hall beneath the stairs, Thomas nudged aside a curled strip of lath and found a folded square of paper protected beneath it. He expected nothing more than a scrap of ledger or a bill of lading from a century ago, but when he brushed the ash from the edges, a line of dark handwriting surfaced. "If someone finds this place, don't destroy what you cannot understand. No signature, no context." The paper smelled faintly of smoke and something like lavender trapped in old fibers. He pressed his thumb to the fold, then slipped the note into his pocket. For now, he told himself, it was better to keep it a thing to consider and not yet share. They learned the language of the building by listening. Some groans meant settling, some clicks meant cooling. Some small rains of dust were warnings, and Thomas propped 2x4s beneath the ribs of ceiling that muttered too much. Yet other sounds did not announce themselves as workaday physics. Late on the fourth evening, after the generator's hum had softened, a sound moved above them, soft, deliberate, as if weight shifted from heel to toe, crossing the empty space where the second-floor hall had lost half its boards. Thomas held up a finger without turning his head. Evelyn froze. He said, "Raccoons," but the word seemed to change shape as it left his mouth. They walked the ground floor with a flashlight, the beam cutting a clean tunnel through the dusty dark. Nothing shifted in the light. Nothing scampered off. The beam landed at last on the staircase, and something in the way, the light diffracted along the lowest steps, made Thomas pause. The ash beneath the first rise lay unnaturally smooth, like a lake at dawn, which was wrong because everywhere else the floor was uneven with debris. He eased the toe of his boot into the surface and left a clean, deep print. The next morning, when they returned, the surface was smooth again. Thomas stared, then told himself a draft or a dog or a night wanderer could have disturbed it. He had logical drawers in his mind and reached for them one by one, shutting each firmly after use. Evelyn began locking the doors each dusk, though some had nothing left to catch. She slid fallen chairbacks and a salvaged bureau against the stubborn ones. She folded wool blankets at the foot of their trailer bed and woke sometimes to the hushed percussion of the wind threading through exposed rafters, making a distant, unsteady whistle like a kettle that never admits its boiling. When she told Thomas in the morning, he kissed her forehead and said, "Wood moves. Sound travels. You are tired." He wasn't dismissing her. He was putting words where there were none yet. That afternoon, as the sun knelt low and warm along the western ridge, she stood again at the foot of the stairs. The ash lay smooth, the print gone, the surface a single thought. She crouched and pressed her fingertips into the cool dust, then drew them back and waited for something to change. Nothing did. She told herself she would not step there again. She rose and, in the mirror that had somehow survived the flames, in a tarnished, cracked way, caught the smoke-colored smudge that renovation leaves on a face. Her eyes looked tired and certain. Thomas kept building a structure of small decisions. Brace here, remove there, save this, abandon that. He installed a temporary bulb on a long lead, so light pooled in the hall, if only to prove darkness was a thing you could push. He checked the generator twice, then stepped out with the dogs to the edge of the property, where the field gave way to a fence, and the fence to the road. The gravel here held stories, and he read them the way he read wood grain. 2 sets of prints this time, newer than yesterday, entering the drive and then stopping as if the night had swallowed the walkers whole before they reached the porch. He scanned the broken windows and thought he saw a flicker, nothing more than the reflection of his own lamp against a shard, a trick that required no superstition. Still, he took the dogs inside earlier than usual, when the sheriff's bulletin rolled by his memory. No trespassing. Call if you see anyone. He pictured himself dialing and saying, "We hear things that may be raccoons." He didn't call. He checked the makeshift latch on the back door and the wedge he had set beneath it. He walked past the stairs without looking down and sat with Evelyn on the hearth where an old fireplace had collapsed in on itself like a chest that could no longer hold breath. They listened to the tiny variations in the generator's hum, the insects, the way their own heartbeats rose in moments when silence grew too concentrated. It was not that they were superstitious. They had both survived the kind of city years that leave you practical. But the house asked to be treated not as a machine, not as a puzzle, but as a patient who had already told you what hurts if you would only listen. That night the steps returned, a slow procession, measured and impossibly gentle. Like a metronome someone set to the house's original heartbeat. You could almost believe this was the rhythm at which conversations once moved from parlor to stair to bed. Thomas kept his breathing even and counted in his head. The count carried him to quiet. When he rose and aimed the flashlight, the hall appeared empty. The ash beneath the first stair reflected the beam with a dull, even sheen. He felt the inexplicable urge to apologize aloud, and did not. Morning broke gray and pale, the light coming through jagged panes in strips. The air inside felt thicker than the air beyond the threshold. The dogs refused the doorway and paced an unsteady figure 8 near the gate, as if unwilling to bring their noses closer to where the house held its old, stubborn scent. Evelyn set coffee on an overturned crate by the wall and watched Thomas watching the staircase. "We don't need to go faster than we can," she said. He nodded, kneeling to examine a split in the lowest step, letting practical concerns reassert themselves, as he preferred. He ran a fingertip along the seam where tread met riser, mapping pressure points, the way he'd learned by trial across years of repair. He could say with authority that the lower section would need to be stripped and rebuilt. The middle sections might carry weight with careful bracing. The upper section should be left untouched for now. These answers soothed him. Design, sequence, structure. Yet even as he spoke them aloud, the strange correctness of the ash tugged at the corner of his attention. By noon the rhythm of work re-established itself. He set braces beneath the cracked landing, each wedge a small vote in favor of future stability. He replaced shattered panes on the south wall, and for the first time a brightness returned to that side of the hall. Dust rose and spun like pale snow in the slanted sun. Evelyn found the broom with the best surviving bristles and coaxed the floor into recognizable shapes. She fetched a bucket and sponge, and, in the kitchen that wasn't yet a kitchen, wiped down tile squares until color began to show through the soot. "Yellow," she said, surprised. It used to be yellow. She could almost see the room restored, a bowl of lemons on a table, morning light lifted out of winter by their brightness. In the late afternoon, the agent returned with a thin folder for them to sign, something about a utility easement and a boundary that had shifted on paper 2 owners ago. He paused with one foot on the porch, uncertain whether to enter. "How's it looking?" he asked. "Better," Thomas said. "It knows we're staying." The agent laughed in the reflexive, brittle way of someone trying not to be impolite to an idea he didn't share. "Well, I'll let you get to it." He hovered long enough to be sure they weren't going to talk about lights or sounds, then backed away to the car, sat for a minute with his hands on the wheel, and drove off down the lane. The sound of the engine faded quickly, as if the valley swallowed moving noises fast. Evening drew a clean line through the house. They ate simple food and leaned against the cool brick outside, listening to the insects lift their chorus, the way they always seem to sing exactly as darkness finds its footing. Evelyn closed her eyes and pictured paint layered thin and careful over wood, her palm finding smoothness where now there was only ash. She pictured a rug she hadn't found yet and a chair they didn't own. She pictured laughter that wasn't borrowing space from the past. When she opened her eyes, the house held still around them, not a promise and not a threat, only attention. They locked what they could and blocked what would not lock. The trailer light clicked off. The generator hummed. If danger existed, it would have to announce itself in plain language. Fear was not allowed to invent nouns. When sleep came, it did so in shallow pools. She dreamed she stood halfway up the staircase, and someone was above her, not descending and not climbing, simply there, visible in the corner of her sight. The dream gave her no face, only the outline of posture. A woman at rest, waiting to see whether she would be heard. Evelyn lifted her hand, and the figure answered with stillness, which in the dream meant yes. She woke at an hour that offered neither night nor morning and listened. Somewhere in the belly of the house, a sound started up again, weight shifting carefully from one tread to the next, as though protecting a secret beneath the risers. The sound lasted long enough to count, and then stopped. She exhaled, turned her face into the pillow, and allowed the fear and the ache and the fragile hope to share the same space in her chest. At dawn, the ash beneath the first stair was smooth again. Thomas stood with his arms folded, holding the silence between them like an agreement with the house itself. He lifted his eyes to meet hers. "We'll fix this part soon," he said, and although the sentence meant wood and tools and time, it also meant something else they would learn how to say. Morning slid into the hall in thin, hesitant bands, catching dust in its slow drift. The ash beneath the first stair was smooth again, so perfectly leveled that Thomas stood over it with the same quiet bafflement as the day before. He didn't step into it this time. He didn't need to. The surface itself said, "Someone has been here, and someone does not wish to be seen." They went to work to steady their nerves. Work had rules, and rules had a way of shrinking the inexplicable. Thomas moved down the corridor with a pry bar and bucket, lifting loose strips of flooring that bowed under their own memory of heat. Nails gave like teeth in damp wood. Evelyn followed with the broom that still had most of its bristles, pushing soot and plaster into small, obedient piles. Every sweep revealed a new pattern in the boards, a ring where a table had lived, a long scar where a rug's edge had once pressed. Here and there, the house yielded small relics. She found a ceramic button that had escaped the fire by hiding under a fallen register, a brass key so eaten by heat that its shape was more suggestion than edge. She lined them on a crate and labeled the page in her notebook, Hall Day 5. When Thomas knelt to shore the torn skirting at the base of the stairs, his hand brushed the underside of the lowest tread. He felt roughness where he expected smooth burn. He pushed aside a curl of char and reached up farther. His fingers closed on paper, brittle and firm, preserved by the dry stillness between riser and stringer. He teased it free. It was the same folded square he'd found under a slat on the first night. He recognized the lavender trace that clung to its fibers like a rumor, but he had not truly looked at it. He had pocketed it then, not ready for words. He set the note on a plank across his knees and blew ash from the crease. The fold opened with the softest tear, as if it remembered being unfolded before. Ink, dark even in this light, formed a single line, steady and deliberate. If someone finds this place, don't destroy what you cannot understand. No name, no date. Just that sentence, as measured as a verdict. Evelyn had stopped sweeping. She watched the words as if they were appearing for the first time, and in a sense they were. "Who wrote it?" she asked. "I don't know," he said. He looked at the staircase, at the risers like unblinking lids. "But it wasn't meant to scare us away. Not exactly. It's a boundary." "A boundary," she repeated. The word calmed her. Boundaries could be respected. "Then we go carefully." They taped the note inside the lid of a metal toolbox so they wouldn't lose it and would not accidentally carry it around like an open wound. Every time Thomas reached for a chisel or tape measure that day, he saw the sentence and felt its weight redistribute the choices in his hands. He did not tell himself a story about ghosts. He told himself that someone once protected something here, knowledge, grief, a life, and asked the next person to tread lightly. The request felt reasonable. By late morning, he was reinforcing the landing with 2x4s he had cut to fit beneath the joists like careful splints. He worked the wedge with a slow mallet, listening to the pitch of the strike, the answering groan as wood met wood. The house spoke in these exchanges if you knew how to hear it. He did. He spoke back in shims and screws. Evelyn moved past the stairs into the front parlor. Smoke stains had crawled there in jagged waves. Inside the pattern, she found ovals where portraits had been, silhouettes left by the protection of frames now gone. A family had hung there, in triplicate or quartet faces once watching. Evelyn wiped the wall with a damp cloth and made no progress. The soot bled into the cloth and then bled back out again in a darker smear. She laughed softly at herself and folded the cloth into quarters, using a fresh corner that only made the wall look briefly damp instead of cleaner. "All right," she said to the room. "You get to keep your shadows for now." They ate on the porch steps. Bread, cheese, an apple divided carefully so that the two halves still understood they were once a whole. A breeze turned and ran through the hallway. Even outdoors, the smell of old smoke stirred as if it were a living thing drawn to their voices. "Do you feel it?" Evelyn asked. "Like it's watching." He didn't look at her when he answered. "I feel that it's old, and that old things deserve patience." He set the apple core on the railing and turned it with his thumb. "We're going to be fine." She accepted his practical blessing the way she always did, as a promise he intended to keep with work. After lunch, she returned to the hall and began following the faint trail of ash that dusted the wall beneath the banister, curious whether it thickened or thinned. By the time she reached the newel post, the light had shifted. Sun fell through the replaced south panes and made a slanted stage of the floor. In that bright trapezoid lay the smooth ash under the first step, still unmarked. She crouched at its edge, close enough to see the grain of the soot like silt at the bottom of a river. The air there felt cooler. She placed her palm on the floorboards just beyond, and warmth rose from the wood into her skin, as if the day had been saved and stored there. The temperature line between warm board and cool ash made the hair on her forearms lift. She drew back and stood, telling herself not to watch it for too long, the way a child is taught not to stare at the sea if she's afraid of being pulled in. She returned to sweeping, found an old nail that had curled as it melted and resolidified, and set it on the crate with the other small lives that the house had not quite ended. In the afternoon, they turned their attention to the kitchen. Under soot, the tiles did gleam yellow, and Evelyn's insistence that the room had once held mornings seemed less like an act of will and more like a memory the house allowed her to borrow. Thomas pulled a cracked cabinet face from the wall. Behind it, a run of lath had been scorched to lace. He knocked softly with the back of his knuckles, listening for hollow. Halfway down, the pitch changed. He cut a neat rectangle, trying not to imagine he was opening a door to anything other than empty space. As the panel fell away, the bottom edge struck something and made a thin metallic chime. He reached in and closed his fingers around a small, heavy shape. When it came into the light, they both leaned in. The object was a rectangle of metal and slag fused by heat. One side was matte and blistered, the other irregularly smooth, where a flame had licked and then retreated. Across one corner, beneath a skin of carbon, letters rose in low relief. He rubbed them gently with the hem of his shirt until they clarified. EM. Evelyn put her hands on the counter to keep from reaching out too quickly. EM, she said. Edward Mason. Maybe, Thomas said. The object was too small to be a tool, too finished to be scrap, too marked to be random. Or a label from something that belonged to him. A plate, a tag. He turned it in his palm. Cold radiated from it as if it had its own weather. He felt the urge to drop it and the opposing urge to cradle it. He set it down on a folded rag as if it were a delicate animal still deciding whether to trust his touch. They stood with it for a moment in silence, the way you do in a museum when an object insists that it contains a life you'll never fully know. Then Evelyn fetched her notebook, made a sketch as accurately as she could, and wrote beneath it, Slab EM, found in kitchen wall, behind burned cabinet face. She added the time and drew a small star. Let's not keep it in the house overnight, Thomas said. The suggestion came out of him without a plan. He heard it as he said it. It wasn't fear exactly. It was the instinct to not disturb whatever line they were walking with more weight than necessary. He carried the piece to the trailer and set it in a plastic bin with a lid that clicked. He glanced at the toolbox as he passed and saw the sentence on the taped note again. Don't destroy what you cannot understand. He did not feel accused. He felt instructed. By late day, a wind gathered from the north, the kind that made the valley's grasses lift like a congregation preparing to stand. The porch screen hummed. A loose hinge somewhere clicked in time. They closed the sash on the south windows, now fitted with new panes, but the house was too riddled with missing to be sealed. The air thinned and cooled inside anyway. They ate early, then walked the periphery of the property with the dogs to learn the edges by their feet. The fence ran true for a while, then jogged where the land dipped, then straightened again. They would need to mend it. Mending felt like a word the house would accept. At dusk, they checked the doors. The back door's jury-rigged latch resisted, then caught. Evelyn slid a chair under the knob in the front hall as an old-fashioned appeal to friction and habit. She picked up the ballerina figurine from the mantel, studied the half-face with its smooth, blank eye, and returned it with care. You can stay, she said again, and realized she meant it for more than the porcelain. They tried a movie on the small laptop in the trailer. The sound turned low, but the story couldn't compete with the thin, constant music that old buildings make minute ticks and drafts and shivers. They set the computer aside. When the generator dipped, regained, then held, Evelyn felt her heartbeat follow the same pattern and laughed quietly at herself. I'll be less jumpy in a week, she said. In 2, Thomas said, smiling because he wanted his confidence to be available to her whenever she looked up to borrow it. Sleep came anyway. At some hour the house was neither waking nor resting. At some hour the air itself seemed to lean in. Evelyn's dream returned. The staircase, her hand on the banister, a woman above her whose face remained out of reach, white dress smudged gray where soot had kissed it. No menace, only waiting. This time in the dream, Evelyn spoke. "We're listening," she said. The woman's weight shifted, not forward, not away, simply settled, and that, in the logic of dreams, meant approval. She woke to the soft, unhesitant sound of footsteps overhead, measured and slow, following the long course of the second-floor hall that no longer existed in any continuous way. She lay still, counting 7, 8, 9, until the numbers became a kind of prayer. Beside her, Thomas stirred, then went quiet deliberately. The dogs lifted their heads, ears pricked, but mouths closed. In the morning, they found the front door ajar. The chair slid 2 inches along the floor, as if moved by a careful hand. Outside, in the fine grit of the porch, faint arcs marked where a shoe had pivoted. The prints were not clear enough to follow, only clear enough to suggest an approach and a retreat. Thomas said nothing for a long moment. Then he knelt and measured the gap the door had opened, no more than a hand's width, and pressed the latch back into place as if showing the house the exact gesture needed to keep itself shut. They walked the perimeter again after coffee, looking for signs of trespass in daylight's plain grammar. At the side yard where the grass thinned to packed earth near a spigot, a series of small marks led to the foundation and then stopped, as though the visitor, human or otherwise, had simply dissolved into the wall. "Animals," Thomas said. "Cats, a raccoon." He wanted it to be true. He let it be true for now. Evelyn returned to the hall. The ash beneath the first stair had reset to perfect again. She stood over it without kneeling, as if bending would be an admission the surface was asking for. The coolness that met her shins felt like the breath of a cellar door opening somewhere far away. She spoke to it as she might speak to a child, too proud to name its hurt. "We're not here to ruin you," she said, and felt a foolishness that didn't embarrass her. They fell back into work. Midday came, shadows shortened, then began to reach again. In the pantry off the kitchen, Thomas pried a length of trim and found behind it a pocket of white-gray dust protected from the currents of the fire. It looked like ash from a colder world. He sifted it with 2 fingers and struck metal again, smaller this time, almost lost in the powder. He lifted a sliver no bigger than a matchbox lid, just as heavy as the first piece. He turned it so the soot slid and the surface beneath caught the light. On this one the letters were crisper, though still scorched at the edges. E.M. "Another," Evelyn said when he brought it into the kitchen. She had been washing a section of tile and left behind long, clean strokes that looked like the marks of a tide going out. She dried her hands and leaned close. "It's not an accident." "No," he said. He set the sliver beside the first piece on the rag. 2 pieces of the same story with their own gravity. "It isn't." He didn't make a theory. He didn't connect names. He didn't dress hunches up as facts. He simply acknowledged that the house contained, in its walls and hollows, more than salvage and char. It contained intention. The note had said as much. Evening leaned in, warm and then quickly chill, the way fall evenings do when the sun drops past the ridge and the temperature comes with it. They ate on the porch again, because rituals matter most when nothing else does. The valley made that low, contented hush that farms and fields make when everyone who needs to be under a roof has found one. A far-off dog answered another far-off dog, like a call and response older than language. "Do you think she wrote it?" Evelyn asked suddenly. Who? The note. Don't destroy what you cannot understand. She glanced through the doorway at the staircase, as if the sentence hung beneath the first riser like a plaque. Mrs. Mason. He rubbed his palms together, more to feel the heat he'd gathered from his mug than to clean them. If she did, we'll know. If someone else did, we'll know that too. He looked out at the fence line. But either way, we honor it. She nodded. The decision felt less like choosing and more like discovering the only real option available. Honor the boundary. Move forward slowly. Listen. They closed the doors again. They set the chair again. The dogs settled sooner, as if they had absorbed the rhythm of the place and adjusted their hearing to the right frequencies. The generator's hum smoothed into a single, reassuring note. The ash in the hall waited. The staircase kept its counsel. Near midnight, the wind shifted and crept under the eaves through broken seams, breathing a thin, cool thread through the rooms. The house clicked once, deep in its frame, the way a sleeping body sometimes readjusts before sinking farther into rest. Thomas dreamt of joints and angles and weight distributions. In his dream, every brace he set became a word in a sentence that made sense. Evelyn's dream was the staircase again, but closer. The woman stood a few steps above, facing the turn of the rail, head inclined as though listening to something below. Evelyn reached the landing and waited. No face came, but a scent did, subtle and clean, like lavender pressed between old pages. She woke with the trace of that scent in her nose, and the feeling, not of fear, but of being expected to follow a direction she could not yet see. Before dawn they rose to the small sounds of a house that hadn't quite decided whether to accept them. Thomas lit the hall bulb, and the light pooled like a low lake around the stairs. The ash was smooth. The door was shut. The chair was where they'd left it. The 2 EM fragments lay on the rag in the kitchen, cool and sure, as if time couldn't nudge them. He touched the note in the toolbox without opening the lid, like a hand laid on a shoulder in passing. Today, he said, not entirely sure what promise the word contained. We go slower still. Good, Evelyn answered, and poured coffee into their tin cups. She tore a page from her notebook, wrote a single line, "We are listening," and tucked it into her pocket, the way Thomas had tucked the first note into his. She didn't plan to leave it anywhere, not yet. But she liked the way the words felt near her. The day widened, the rooms brightened, the boundary held, the house watched. And under the first stair, the ash lay as flawlessly as if a hand had smoothed it in the night and then hovered, just above the surface, waiting for them to understand. The morning began with a thin fog that rolled through the valley like slow smoke, wrapping itself around the blackened eaves of the house. The world outside looked blurred and hollow, but inside the air carried purpose. Thomas moved through the hall with a measured focus, hammer and tape measure in hand, while Evelyn, notebook pressed to her chest, followed the faint lines of soot on the walls. They had both slept poorly. The sound of footsteps above had come again, slower, more deliberate, and when Thomas went to check, he found nothing, just dust and old air. But the tension had changed him. He worked now with quiet insistence, as if every nail he drove might force the past a little further away. Evelyn, meanwhile, couldn't stop thinking about the metal plates marked EM and the strange note hidden beneath the stairs. The initials lingered in her mind like a whisper. Edward Mason. The man whose house this was. The man who, according to the agent, died in the fire 6 years ago. She opened her notebook and wrote the name at the top of a blank page. Under it she drew 2 rectangles, the metal fragments, and circled them twice. Thomas, she said finally, standing in the doorway. What if he left something behind, something he didn't want destroyed? He didn't look up from his work. Like what? Money? Old family papers? She hesitated. No, something else. He smiled without humor. You're starting to sound like those locals and their ghost stories. But later, when he pried open a warped panel on the landing, his chisel struck something that didn't sound like wood. He froze. The echo was sharper, hollower, a small metallic tone hidden in the burnt bones of the house. He worked the chisel in again, careful now, until a thin seam appeared. Behind the panel, a narrow compartment had been carved into the wall. Inside lay a blackened envelope and a photograph, the edges fused with soot. Evelyn hurried to his side as he brushed the debris away. The photo showed a man and a woman standing before the same staircase, younger, smiling, unaware of what was to come. The man's hand rested gently on the woman's shoulder, his wedding band gleaming faintly. On the back of the photo, in faded ink, was written, Edward and Catherine, 1949. The envelope had burned through at one corner, but a folded page inside survived. Thomas unfolded it carefully. The writing, though smudged, was graceful, a woman's hand, elegant and precise. If the fire comes, it will not be by accident. They want what he built, but I will not give it to them. They exchanged a look that carried both awe and fear. The words turned everything upside down. The fire wasn't an accident. Someone had wanted something from this house, something that Edward Mason had refused to surrender. Evelyn's fingers trembled as she reached for the photograph again. She knew, she whispered. Catherine Mason knew they were coming. Thomas folded the paper and slid it into his pocket. We should stop for today, he said quietly. But Evelyn shook her head. No, we can't. Not now. They kept working through the afternoon, turning the house piece by piece, searching for more. Beneath a fallen beam in what had once been the study, Thomas found a small chest half melted into the floorboards. Inside were shards of glass, scraps of letters, and one thing untouched, a leather-bound diary, its edges blackened but intact. Evelyn opened it as if unsealing a relic. The first pages were dated decades earlier. Catherine Mason's writing filled them, graceful, deliberate. She wrote of the house, of her husband's work, of the joy of building something from nothing. But as the pages turned, the tone shifted. She began describing men who visited late at night, voices near the porch, and arguments that ended in silence. Edward had been working on something, an invention, she wrote, a discovery that could change everything. But others wanted it for themselves. He had hidden it, even from her at first, but eventually confessed. Evelyn read aloud. He says it's metal that won't burn. He calls it Helix. He says it could survive the end of the world. But if they find out, they'll take it from us. I told him to destroy it. He said he couldn't. You don't destroy light, he told me. You hide it until the dark passes. The words made the room colder. Thomas leaned against the doorway, the diary's weight now heavier than anything else in the house. Project Helix, he murmured, repeating the word like it was alive. That evening, neither of them spoke much. The dogs barked occasionally, pacing the perimeter, uneasy. When the sun dipped, Thomas set up the small generator again, stringing cables through the hall to power a single bulb above the staircase. He couldn't say why, but he needed that light there to keep the dark from claiming it again. As Evelyn flipped through the final pages of the diary, she found the handwriting jagged, trembling. Catherine wrote of gasoline, of voices outside, of Edward yelling from the basement. The last line ended abruptly. If anyone finds this the truth. The pen had torn the paper mid-stroke. Thunder rolled outside, soft at first, then closer. Rain began to fall through the cracked windows, sizzling where it met the old embers on the porch. The A smell of wet ash filled the air. Thomas closed the diary gently. "We stop here for tonight," he said. "We need rest." But Evelyn couldn't move. Her eyes lingered on the staircase, on the spot beneath the first step, where the ash always smoothed itself overnight. "Thomas," she whispered, "what if that's where he hid it?" He followed her gaze, jaw tightening. The idea seemed absurd, and yet everything in this house had led back to that place. The note, the initials, the diary. When they finally went to bed, the storm deepened. The generator flickered, and the single light in the hall began to sway. Evelyn woke hours later to the rhythmic creak of wood. Footsteps again, deliberate, measured. Then came the faint scrape of something metallic sliding across the floor. She sat up, her pulse pounding. The sound moved toward the staircase, then stopped. The silence that followed was heavier than any noise. By morning, the storm had passed, but the air inside the house was colder than before. When Thomas opened the door, a gust of wind swept through the hall, carrying a thin veil of ash from the staircase, ash that had shifted again, forming a faint, unnatural curve across the floor, like the outline of a door. Evelyn knelt beside it, whispering, "She's trying to show us." Thomas said nothing, but his eyes had changed. He no longer doubted that the house was speaking, and that Catherine Mason was not finished telling her story. The storm had washed the air clean, but inside the house, the chill clung like memory. The morning sun spilled through the cracked window panes, fractured into narrow ribbons of light that sliced through dust and shadow. Evelyn stood at the base of the staircase, her eyes fixed on the strange outline left in the ash, a curved shape beneath the first step, as if something beneath was pressing upward, waiting to be found. Thomas came down the hall with his toolbox, his face lined from another sleepless night. He followed her gaze, his expression caught between doubt and acceptance. "We'll find out what's down there," he said finally, voice low, deliberate. "But we do it carefully." The rest of the morning passed in silence. Evelyn gathered the diary, laying it open to Catherine's final pages. She ran her finger over the torn line where the words had stopped. "If anyone finds this, the truth." It ended there, the ink scratched and broken. By noon, Thomas had cleared the area around the staircase. He knelt beside the outline and began to work, brushing away the top layer of soot. The air filled with a dry, acrid smell, the scent of old fire and rusted metal. Beneath the ash, he struck something solid, not wood, but concrete, smoother and newer than the surrounding foundation. He looked up at Evelyn. "This isn't original," he said. "Someone sealed this after the fire." Evelyn's breath caught. "Then it's true. She hid something here." Thomas fetched the crowbar and hammer, tapping gently along the surface until a hollow note answered back. The sound echoed like a pulse through the hall. Evelyn's heart matched its rhythm. Piece by piece, he chipped away the hardened layer, revealing the faint rectangular outline of a door built into the foundation itself. The edges were scorched but intact. He brushed away the dust until a metal plate came into view, a hidden latch fused shut by age. "Help me hold the light," he said. Evelyn leaned closer, her flashlight trembling slightly in her grip. When the first blow struck, the sound was deafening. The second echoed deeper. On the third, the latch gave way with a low metallic groan, and a thin breath of air escaped. Cold, stale, heavy with the scent of oil and old metal. A dark opening yawned beneath the stairs. Evelyn's hand found Thomas's arm. "Do you feel that?" she whispered. The air that drifted out was different, colder than the rest of the room, but somehow alive. Thomas nodded. "There's a chamber." He pulled the lantern from the workbench and lowered it through the gap. The light revealed a narrow passage descending into darkness, its walls lined with rusted pipes and scorched concrete. "Looks like an access tunnel," he murmured. "Probably led to the basement." Evelyn swallowed hard. "Or something they built afterward." He didn't answer. He set one foot on the first rung of the ladder that led down. It groaned beneath his weight but held. Evelyn followed, clutching the diary against her chest. The passage twisted slightly, the light from above fading until the lantern's glow became their only world. The air thickened with the smell of iron and soot. At the end of the tunnel stood a small steel door, nearly identical to the one they had just opened. This one, too, was sealed with rust. Thomas braced the crowbar in pride. The metal moaned, resisting, then yielded. The hinges cried out once and went still. Behind the door lay a chamber no larger than a bedroom, a hidden workshop, untouched since the night of the fire. The walls were lined with shelves cluttered with melted glass, twisted tools, and fragments of half-finished machines. Papers and sketches lay scattered across a work table, edges blackened but still legible. In the center of the room stood a large steel container, its lid warped by heat but unbroken. Evelyn stepped forward, her breath trembling. The word "Helix" was faintly engraved on the lid. Thomas wiped the surface clean with his sleeve. "Project Helix," he whispered. "It's real." Evelyn opened the diary again, flipping back through the pages until she found the entry where Catherine wrote about her husband's creation. "He says it's metal that won't burn. They will want it for their weapons. If the fire comes, it will not be by accident." She traced the words with her thumb, her voice breaking slightly. "They killed them for this." Thomas knelt beside the container, examining the clasps. They were welded shut, but one hinge had been weakened by time. He worked it loose, the metal protesting, but eventually giving way. The lid opened with a dull groan. Inside lay a smaller cylinder of polished metal, sealed tight, its surface gleaming like new. Beside it rested several sealed envelopes tied with a faded silk ribbon. The top envelope bore the handwriting they had come to recognize. "To the one who finds this, may truth be your guide, not greed." Evelyn lifted it gently, her fingertips black with soot. Inside was a single page, written in careful, deliberate strokes. "They came again tonight. Edward says they will return with fire if he does not give them what they want. He asked me to hide the helix where only faith can find it. If you are reading this, know that we did not die by chance. Keep it safe. Do not let them use it for harm." Evelyn pressed the page to her chest, tears forming in her eyes. "She knew everything," she whispered. "She wrote this for us." Thomas stared at the gleaming cylinder inside the container. "And now we've found what they died to protect." The air in the chamber seemed to shift, a faint vibration through the floor, a whisper of movement, almost like a breath. Evelyn turned toward the sound, but there was nothing, just the faint flicker of the lantern's flame against the soot-dark walls. "What do we do with it?" she asked softly. Thomas didn't answer right away. His eyes moved from the metal cylinder to the diary, then to her. "If they could kill for it once, they could kill for it again," he said finally. "We can't take it anywhere. It belongs here." Evelyn looked down at the note again. The last words shimmered faintly in the lantern light. "Keep it safe." She nodded slowly. "Then we seal it back, just like she did." They worked in silence, closing the lid and wiping away the soot. Before they left, Evelyn tore a small page from her notebook, writing in careful strokes. "We heard you. The house is safe." She folded it and placed it beside Catherine's last letter. When they climbed back through the tunnel and into the light, the air above felt different, lighter somehow, as though the house itself had exhaled. The smell of burnt wood was gone. Thomas brushed the ash from his hands. "We'll seal it tomorrow," he said. let it rest. That night, as they sat outside beneath the pale glow of the porch light, Evelyn watched the dark outline of the mansion against the sky. For the first time since they arrived, she didn't feel fear, only sorrow and a quiet understanding. The wind moved through the eaves, soft and low, like the sigh of a woman who had waited too long to be heard. And inside, beneath the staircase, something ancient and gentle seemed finally at peace. Morning returned with a stillness so profound that even the wind hesitated. The house stood beneath a pale sky, washed clean by the night's rain, its soot-dark walls glowing faintly gold in the early light. For the first time, Thomas and Evelyn woke without dread. There was only calm, a fragile, unfamiliar peace that seemed to breathe with them. The day before, they had resealed the passage beneath the stairs, layering new mortar over the steel door until the surface was once again whole. The words, "We heard you. The house is safe," lay hidden within the wall beside Catherine Mason's letters. The secret now belonged to the house again, and the weight of that decision had settled over them like quiet absolution. Thomas brewed coffee on the small camping stove and stood by the window, looking out over the valley. Mist clung to the grass where the fire's ashes had once turned the earth gray. Evelyn joined him, her hair loose, her expression softer than he'd seen in weeks. "It feels lighter," she said, "like it's finally breathing again." He nodded. "We gave it back what was never ours." They spent the next days repairing instead of searching. Thomas sanded the staircase until its dark char began to reveal hints of warm wood beneath. Each stroke of the paper felt like a prayer, a way of smoothing the scars without erasing them. Evelyn painted the walls a pale cream that caught sunlight and sent it spilling into corners long starved of warmth. They replaced shattered panes, polished the banister, and brought music back into the rooms. The air changed. The smell of smoke faded, replaced by the scent of paint and new timber. Even the creaks of the floorboards grew softer, rhythmic, no longer warnings but signs of life. Neighbors from the nearby town began to visit. Most had stayed away for years, afraid of the stories, the lights in the windows, the whispers after dark, the curse of the fire. Now curiosity overcame fear. One elderly man lingered near the front steps, staring up at the restored banister. "I used to see lanterns up there at night," he said. "Thought it was ghosts." Evelyn smiled gently. Maybe it was someone who didn't want to be forgotten. The man nodded slowly. Maybe she's at peace now. By evening, the guests had gone. The house was quiet again, but no longer empty. Thomas lit the lantern and placed it at the base of the staircase. The light shimmered against the polished rail, tracing the steps upward into the dark where once there had been only ruin. On the wall beside them hung a single framed letter, the first one Catherine had written. "To the one who finds this, may truth be your guide, not greed." Evelyn sat beside Thomas on the newly restored steps. He put an arm around her, and for the first time in months, they allowed themselves to be still. The silence was not heavy anymore. It was full of breath, of memory, of gratitude. "It's strange," Evelyn said. "I keep thinking I'll hear her again, that sound on the stairs." Thomas smiled faintly. "Maybe you will. Maybe it's her way of saying thank you." They watched the lantern light dance on the walls, gold and alive. Outside, the trees swayed gently, their leaves whispering through the open window. Somewhere beyond the valley, a train sounded in the distance, a low, fading hum, like the house itself sighing in relief. When they finally went to bed, the hall light flickered once and went out. The generator hummed quietly, steady and content. For a moment, in the stillness, there came a familiar sound, footsteps, slow and light, descending the staircase one last time. Evelyn stirred in her sleep, a faint smile brushing her lips. Downstairs, the moonlight spilled across the framed letter. The ink shimmered faintly, and for a heartbeat, the outline of a woman appeared at the foot of the stairs. Her figure graceful, her eyes calm, her expression full of peace. Then the image faded, leaving only the soft creak of settling wood. At dawn, sunlight entered freely through the clean panes, scattering across the floorboards like gold dust. The house no longer smelled of fire or sorrow. The wind moved gently through its rafters, not as a whisper of warning, but as a quiet breath of life. Evelyn found Thomas in the kitchen, 2 cups of coffee waiting on the counter. Neither spoke. They didn't need to. The house had told its story, and they had listened. That was enough. As they stepped outside, the door closed behind them with a soft, deliberate click. Not final, not haunting, but certain. The past now slept beneath the stairs, sealed in the quiet heart of the home where love, invention, and tragedy had once intertwined. And in the golden morning light, the Mason house stood not as a ruin of what was lost, but as a testament to what endures, memory, truth, and the mercy that comes to those who choose to rebuild. The house kept its promise, its story finally heard, its ghosts finally at rest. But some secrets never fade. They only wait to be found again. Subscribe for more stories, hit the like button, and tell us in the comments where you're watching from.